Last week, Michael Bancroft dropped the first in a series of videos explaining precisely what Comicsgate is. Bancroft is someone who has described himself as milquetoast, but I think a more accurate description would be that he is measured, calculated, precise, and not prone to hyperbole or speculative argumentation. In other words, he is the perfect candidate to take on such a task. And that first video did not disappoint as Bancroft began dissecting the Wikipedia article on Comicsgate. But despite him only tackling the very first sentence, I feel as though something he touched on may not have been given the attention it deserves, or at the very least may have glossed over something that requires a bit more context. Wikipedia is a hub for propaganda, serving a very exclusive sliver of the political spectrum. Now, this video is not intended to be a response to Michael's or trying to muscle its way into his series. I'd like to think of it as a detour for those that are curious. But when Bancroft describes the extreme biases of Wikipedia, the problem is quite more extensive than this, and it's something that many may not fully understand. It's hard to overestimate just how pervasive it truly is and exactly how much effort goes into controlling both Wikipedia and, by extension, access to information and control of online discourse. So a few years ago, I went to a party attended almost exclusively by grad students, and while I was there, I struck up a conversation with a woman. At first, we were making idle small talk, but after a few minutes, she began telling me about how she is part of a team tasked with infiltrating communities on Reddit. With a strange sense of glee, she described in great detail how they take over subreddits, all of which are, of course, guilty of some vague definition of hate. And once they've successfully infiltrated and made themselves moderators, they would begin driving users away, either with over-moderation or, in some cases, purposely breaking website rules until the site admins banned the subreddit altogether. What was fascinating was how she described all of this to me, assuming that I was just a layperson with no previous understanding of what she was talking about, when in reality it was something I was already very familiar with because it was something I'd been witnessing for years. This is a subreddit called Bad Cop No Donut. Its sole purpose is to highlight the actions of police officers who abuse their power. Users share news stories, social media posts, and many other form of damning information about police officers and police institutions. It has more than 500,000 subscribers, is frequently on the front page, and is often highlighted as a featured community on Reddit. This is a subreddit called Bad Academia. Its purpose was identical to that of Bad Cop No Donut, only instead of police officers and policing institutions, it was directed towards college professors and academic institutions. And as you can see, it's been permanently banned. I don't think I need to point out not just the glaring hypocrisy of this, but how that bias shakes out on the political spectrum. Now, this may sound ludicrous to some of you, but Reddit was actually founded on beliefs of free expression, the open exchange of ideas and information, and the democratic determinations of its user base. It was once a place that almost any community could call home, provided it wasn't predicated on something illegal. But over time, and after the death of founder Aaron Swartz, the window of what was considered acceptable began to shrink, and the definition of what was unacceptable began to include not just what's illegal, but what's hateful, hurtful, distasteful, disliked, mean-spirited towards the wrong groups, and eventually, whatever was damaging to leftist sensibilities. Now, if Reddit, a website founded on the premise of free and open discourse, could become fully compromised in just a few years, what do you think would happen to a site predicated on neutrality? I'm going to tell you two things about Wikipedia that may sound strange. One, no college professor will let you use Wikipedia as a source for any paper. And two, colleges are highly invested in Wikipedia's curation. Don't believe me? Go to your nearest college and find a bulletin board for upcoming events. Odds are you'll find a Wikipedia editing party. It's kind of like those sleepovers where programmers form teams and stay up all night programming, only instead of doing something that could prove useful, it's a bunch of college students editing Wikipedia page at the direction of their professors. There are courses all over the place whose purpose is to get as many people editing Wikipedia under their directive. And the example of the Bad Cop subreddit versus Bad Professor one should tell you precisely why. So, what are they editing? Well, if the Comicsgate Wikipedia article isn't clear enough, let me give you what I think is the most egregious example I've ever found. This is Jonestown, in the South American country of Guyana, where in 1978 a cult consisting of more than 900 members committed ritual suicide at the direction of their leader, Jim Jones. If you aren't familiar with the incident, you may have heard the expression drink the Kool-Aid, which means to become completely brainwashed and refers to the cult members who drank or were forced at gunpoint to drink Kool-Aid that contained cyanide. For those of you that are familiar with Jonestown, what do you actually know about them? What did they believe? What were their goals, or the goals of their leader, Jim Jones? It was a religious thing, right? I mean, that's all you ever hear about when it comes to cults. Well, let's find out. Jim Jones founded the People's Temple in San Francisco in 1955. Okay, so it's a temple. I wonder what religion they practiced. Quote, "Those who remained drugged with the opiate of religion had to be brought to enlightenment, to socialism." So it was a cult, a communist cult, a communist death cult. And why did all this happen? Why did more than 900 people have to die in some South American jungle? Why, it was Jim Jones's, quote, "hatred of racism, sexism, elitism, and mainly classism is what prompted him to make a new world for the people, a paradise in the jungle." Okay, so we're fighting racism, sexism. How did that turn out? Well, it's the 1970s and someone is talking about fighting racism, so naturally 70% of the membership were black. And since, like all cult leaders, Jones liked to use his power to obtain sex, 2/3 of them were women. So, yeah, a lot of black women were killed in the pursuit of anti-racist Marxism. This is Angela Davis, and if there was a Mount Rushmore for black feminism, she would certainly be on it. And a year before the Jonestown Massacre, she gave a speech to them in which she described Jim Jones as, quote, "a friend," and thanked the group for, quote, "what you have done to further the fight for justice, to further the struggle against oppression, to further the fight against racism." During their time in Guyana, the Jonestown colony made frequent attempts to negotiate a mass exodus to the Soviet Union, North Korea, Cuba, basically any communist country that would have them, with Jones himself calling the Soviet Union, quote, "our spiritual motherland." On the day of the massacre, 3 people close to Jones were selected and tasked with carrying out the affairs of the soon-to-be deceased leader. A bag containing more than $500,000 in cash was intended to be delivered to the Soviet embassy in Guyana, along with a note that read, quote, "the following is a letter of instructions regarding all of our assets that we want to leave to the Communist Party of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Enclosed in this letter are letters which instruct the banks to send the cashier's checks to you. I am doing this on behalf of People's Temple because we, as communists, want our money to be of benefit for help to oppressed peoples all over the world." The letter contained banking information for accounts that totaled more than $7 million for transfer to the USSR. Adjusted for inflation, that and the cash amounts to just shy of $35 million. If you've ever taken a journalism class or put together an Indiegogo campaign, then you'll understand this principle, the order of information. When you assemble a news article or a campaign page, you always want to put the most relevant facts up top. You do this because you have to assume that the further you go down the page, the less likely it is to be read. That's just how people's attention works. So you always put the most important ideas at the top. But in journalism, this principle contains a very old form of deception called burying the lead, where you take information that is highly relevant to the subject of the story, but damning to someone's sensibilities, and so it gets buried toward the bottom of the story, counting on most readers to miss those details after only reading the first few paragraphs. So we have a bunch of communists who amassed a bunch of money and a bunch of people, took them all to live in the jungles of South America, and then massacred them by giving them the choice of poison or bullet. It was so insane that I somehow told you about it and forgot to mention that a sitting U.S. congressman came to inspect Jonestown and was machine gunned to death when he tried to leave. This is easily one of the most hideous, gruesome things any cult has ever done, and the story of it is almost too insane to believe. But writing this video required almost no research beyond the Wikipedia article, because nearly all of it is right there for you to see for yourself. And yet, When I read this Wikipedia page, something leaps off of it that screams the most ridiculous of biases. Given everything I've just told you about Jonestown, in what universe would you say, quote, its roots and teachings shared more with Christian revival movements than with Marxism? Why is it that when you begin reading about Jonestown on Wikipedia, you encounter the word Christian before the words Marxism, communism, or socialism? How does a group of communists led by a communist who received tacit support from fellow communists that tried to donate everything they had amassed to other communists before committing what they themselves called, quote, revolutionary suicide, have more to do with Christianity than with Marxism? Or more accurately, why would the internet's biggest archive of information describe them this way? I won't give you the answer because I'm almost certain you know precisely why. But hopefully this at least explains a little bit better why that very first sentence describing Comicsgate says what it says.